Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. McClellan. I'm giving you your lecture for Chapter 4 this week, starting on, actually, I'm on my second slide. Let me go back to the title screen so you can see where you are. So we are now on to the fourth chapter of Athenaze, which covers quite a lot of ground, as you may have noticed from your reading already, or as you're about to learn as you work through the material over the weekend. So let's break some of this down piece by piece, and we'll start with the verbs from this chapter. A lot of this is going to review some of what we talked about in chapter 3. So even though it feels like there's a lot coming at you this chapter, as long as you're keeping up with the readings and your notes and with practice exercises in class, you'll probably find that a lot of this has already started to feel a little bit more like secondhand to you. Some of you maybe more than others, and that's totally fine. We're still early in the semester. But a lot of this is stuff you've already seen and translated before, either together or individually in class. So, as always, I always like to start with just some of the basics with each of the concepts that we're going through. And you'll get sick of me reading this list to you again and again, but it's always remember that whenever we look at a Greek verb on the board, in our readings, anywhere else, you always want to find 5 pieces of information to identify it, which will help you translate it. Person and number, which you can see in the chart, we've gone over those. That's either singular or plural for number, and first, second, and third for person, so you've already gotten familiar with those. Tense tells you when an action occurs. Mood, how real an action is, whether it's something that will definitely happen or perhaps just may happen in a different mood. And voice, which we talked about before, active, middle, and passive. So just keep those in mind as we go through verbs. For now, we're still just dealing with the present tense. So last chapter we saw with certain verbs that you just have to know the basic endings. Like all verbs that we're going to come across, you typically have a stem and an ending that determine what the verb, what action is taking place, and who's performing the action. And I look to the end of the verb to figure that out. So my endings that I want to remember from here are what you see in red on the screen. So I've tacked them onto one of the verbs that you get in this chapter, akuo. Akuo means to hear or to listen, and it's our root for the word acoustic. So if you have good acoustics, it's because in Greek you can hear better, akoues, for example. So going through these one at a time in Greek, I have first person singular akuo. Akuo, I hear or listen. Akoues, you hear. Akoue, he, she, or it hears or listens. Now the plurals on the right side. Akouomen, akouete, and akuusi. That one's a little bit tricky. There's a couple diphthongs in a row there. I'm going to repeat it one more time, that third person plural. Akuusi, akuusi. They hear or listen. You'll also want to remember at this point how to form the imperatives. You guys are doing a really good job today in class with that. So just as a quick review, if I want to tell one person to do something, all I have to do is add an epsilon to the end of that verb stem and say akue. Hey, one of you, listen, akue. Or if I talk to all of you, I'd say akuete. All of you, listen. And then, as you also picked up in class, if I want to use the dictionary definition entry of a verb, if I want to say to do something, I'll put the ending ain, epsilon iota nu, ain, at the end. So akuein, to hear or to listen. Most of the verbs you're going to come across form very regularly like akuo or luo or some of the other verbs that we've had so far. But there are some that you will start to see that will go through contraction. And the way I can tell when a verb is going to go through contraction is by looking at the entry at the top of the slide here. When you memorize these verbs, you'll want to enter them as Athenaze gives them to you because you'll see theoreo is going to go through contraction because when I take the omega off the end to find the stem, in this case theore, I know that last epsilon is going to contract because it's such a weak vowel, it combines with the other vowels in Greek to form different endings. So the key here, as I mentioned in the last lecture, is to know the rules of contraction. Epsilon and epsilon gives us A, the top one on the left. Epsilon with A gives us just a longer A, an epsilon iota with a circumflex. This one is important to remember because it's not intuitive. Epsilon and omicron give me oo, omicron upsilon, totally different. Remember that rule. Epsilon and omicron give me oo. Epsilon and oo gives me just a longer oo. Epsilon and omega gives me a long omega, o. So as long as I can remember those rules, I can form the verb theoreo pretty simply. So First person singular, theoro. I've got epsilon with omega, theoro, I watch. Second person singular, theores. Theores, you watch, just a long epsilon iota. Third person singular, theore. Theore, he, sure, it watches. That should be a little different. Theorumen, that's tricky because I've got theore, my stem, with amen for we. Epsilon and omicron, like you see on the left in the middle, gives me oo. So not theoret amen, but theorumen. Theorumen, we watch. That's important to remember. Second plural, theorete, that's theore with ete, like you saw from the last slide. And finally, theorusin. This is going to be very typical of all epsilon contract verbs, and you will find many of them in Greek. The imperatives, remember those rules for contraction. When I have the stem theore, and I tack on just an epsilon, I get theore, watch. It looks a lot like the third person singular, theore, but notice there's a slight difference in pronunciation. That's because the two short epsilons give me a shorter a. So if I told one of you to watch something, I'd just keep it short, theore. And if I said, hey, so-and-so is watching something, I'd say theore, theore, he, she, or it is watching. It's the only way you can tell the difference. The plural would just be theorete. You need context to figure that out. And the infinitive is pretty easy, theorein. I just contract epsilon with a to form that. That's all you need to know for the verbs from this chapter, and you want to make sure that you go over the endings again and again and practice with a couple different verbs. We'll do a little bit of this on Monday with some of our exercises, but it's really important that you make sure that you know the rules for epsilon contraction and how to add different personal endings to any verb that you're coming across. So if you have any questions about those, please do make sure to send them to me. So let's move on to nouns. In addition to some of the standard ones that you've learned so far, we're going to be adding a little bit more in this chapter. So far, you've learned the one you see highlighted in red, the second declension, where stems end in an O sound, typically with omicron at the endings. And for the most part, nouns that are formed with the second declension that have those O sounds tend to be masculine or neuter, and you can tell based on the way they form their nominatives and so forth, like you guys were picking up in class. The first declension, on the other hand, which we're going to learn about today, typically has stems that end in alpha and eta, and they are mostly feminine. Now notice that I said these are mostly feminine and mostly masculine or neuter, depending on these sounds. What I really want you to pay attention to today is that's not always going to be the case. Not every noun we run across that has an O ending is going to be masculine or neuter. There are occasionally words, and we'll see some of the most important ones today, that are feminine even though they look and sound like all those masculine and neuter nouns in the second declension. So in other words, what I want you to take away from this slide that you're looking at is that declensions don't determine the gender of the word. Oftentimes they correspond to it. A lot of words that end in alpha or eta in their stem are feminine, but not all of them. So declensions have nothing to do with gender. They're simply patterns of sounds in Greek. So we're going to deal with the first two. So just to review for the second declension, take a word like choros, dance, that you learned from this chapter. All the endings that you see in red are your standard masculine endings. As long as you know those, you're able to put them down accordingly. So we'll just go through these really quickly. Choros, choru, choro, choron, chore. Those are my singular forms, so you can also remember os, u, o, on, and e. Let me do the plurals. Choroi, choron, chorois, chorus, choroi. Oi, on, ois, us, and oi. Can repeat those. As long as you can remember those endings, you'll always know how to tack those onto any masculine noun that you come across from the second declension. The neuter endings will take tree. Remember this pattern. You guys have already been working on this on your own. Dendron, dendru, dendro, dendron, and dendron. So remember, with neuter nouns in any declension, the nominative and accusative are always going to be the same. So let's look at the plurals. Dendra, dendron, dendrois, dendra, dendra. It's pretty repetitive. Again, make sure the nominative and accusative are always the same with neuter nouns. So again, you can also remember this by memorizing the sounds you see in red. On, u, o, on, a, on, ois, a. That's your neuter pattern in the second declension. If you can remember those sounds and their appropriate endings, you can tack them onto any neuter noun from the second declension, whether it's dendron or something else. For this chapter, we're going to learn a new declension. The first declension, as I mentioned before, mostly covers feminine nouns, and most of the stems end in alpha and eta. So there's a little bit of history to this. Originally, in early Greek, for Homer, for instance, and even predating Homer, when we get to Linear B texts, almost all nouns that were feminine and from what we call the first declension ended in alpha. But the same old story keeps coming back again and again. It switches to eta for some words over time because the Attic dialect, the dialect of Athens and the surrounding area in central Greece, changed some of those to eta. So you might imagine that Athens was something like the Boston accent of the ancient world, just kind of changing vowels and dropping endings as they wanted. So if it's a little bit confusing today, just remember that it's Athens' fault. The rest of the Greek cities, for the most part, kept it in alpha. But we do have to learn this because most of our texts do come from Athens, so we do have to be aware of some of these important shifts. But it's important to remember that even though the first declension is mostly feminine, there are some nouns, and we'll see that they follow a different pattern than some of the feminine nouns. They use different endings, even though they have alpha and eta, for the most part, echoing through their endings. So we don't want to, in other words, equate the first declension with feminine gender. We have to pay attention to everything else to determine the gender of a noun. So this will make a little more sense as I go through some examples. So let's start with what we could call the eta stem. This is one of the most common patterns you get in the first declension. One of the words you're going to learn from this chapter is heorte, which the genitive is heortes, and its definite article is going to start with he. Notice at the top in red. When I look this up in the book, that he at the beginning of it tells me that it's a feminine noun, and that's the only thing I need to look at to tell that it's feminine. So it's very important that when you're writing these down in your vocab cards and your flashcards, you copy the definite article with it to remind yourself what gender it is. So for a lot of nouns, the alphas and the endings early on switched over to etas. You can kind of hear a similarity in them, a to a, over time. Heorte is one of those words that changes in the Attic dialect, and it's pretty common to find lots of nouns like this. So the eta stems like this go as follows. The nominative will just end in a, so heorte would make it the subject. The festival is nice or fun, for example. The genitive singular ending is ace, so heortes of the festival. Dative is going to be an eta with a small iota subscript underneath it. So heorte is dative to or for the festival. The accusative is going to have a nu at the end, so heortein, if I visit the festival, if I hit the festival, something like that. And the vocative is going to be the same as the nominative, so it's actually pretty easy to work your way through the first declension, heorte, if I talked to a festival for some reason. So let me review just the sounds of that. Heorte, heortes, heorte, heortein, heorte. It's pretty repetitive. You can also just memorize the endings in red for this eta stem pattern. A, ace, a, ain, a. Pretty simple. The nice thing about the first declension is that the plurals are always going to be the same. So if you can memorize this list here, the rest of this lecture is going to start to look very easy very quickly. So if I have more than one festival as my subject in the nominative, I'll call them heortai. That I ending makes them a nominative plural, heortai. Genitive plural is heorton. We've seen that ending before. Heorton of the festivals. Heortais, dative plural, to or for the festivals. Heortas, accusative plural, if I visit festivals. And heortai is my vocative ending if I'm talking to a bunch of festivals, which I don't think will happen in Greek. So let me just repeat the endings so you can hear them in order. I, own, ice, as, I. You can hear all those alphas in the ending. That's the original sound of the first declension, some of which changed over to the etas you heard in the singular. So this is the pattern you're going to use for most of the nouns in the first declension. And the only way I can tell that it's going to follow this system is by knowing the first two forms, the nominative and the genitive, which is why when you're writing these down in your flashcards, it's probably best to put heorte, heortes with he. Those three things up at the top tell you that the first two forms are heorte, heortes. That tells you it's going to have etas in the singular, the festival and of the festival, and they're feminine with he. So that gives you all the information you need to fill out the rest of this chart because you get the first two forms memorized. Let's look at a different one, however. There are lots of nouns that don't undergo this big shift that happens in Athens from alpha to eta. And typically, you may want to remember this rule. I find it very helpful. If the stem of a noun in the first declension ends in epsilon, iota, or rho, then it's going to keep the alpha endings. It's just a feature of the pronunciation in Greek. So a word like hudria, hudria with a genitive hudrios, which is also feminine, so we add a he with it, which means water jar. You can hear the hydro root in it. So if you think of hydroelectric, that's electricity from a water source. Hudria was a water jar, was a water vessel in ancient Greek. So they have a similar root. The stem of that noun, if I take away the alpha ending for the nominative, ends in an iota, as you can see there in the middle at the top in red. Because the stem ends in iota, all of the endings are going to feature alpha instead of eta. So that's a pretty convenient rule to remember. Epsilon and iota and rho are going to have endings with all alphas. So if you can remember that, great. If otherwise, as you're remembering nouns, if you put hudria, hudrios on your flashcards, you'll also know that it's going to keep alphas because those are the first two forms that you get. Hudria, hudrios, and then you'll know to put the rest in there. So let's go through what this system sounds like in the first declension. Hudria for the nominative, the water jug. Hudrias in the genitive of the water jug. Hudria, notice there's an iota subscript there. That's pretty typical of the dative, as you've seen by now. Hudrion for the accusative. And hudria if I'm talking to a water jug in the vocative in my singular. I'm going to go back a slide. Notice how similar that sounds to what we saw in the eta stem. A, ace, a, ain, a, just came from this system. A, as, a, an, a. They're very similar. They're from the same root linguistically, but hudria represents an earlier phase of this. You don't have to remember that, but I find it helpful to know that there's a rhyme and reason to all of these new forms that you're seeing in front of you. So, the nice thing about the first declension is that the plurals are always the same. So, if you already memorized them for heorte, for example, it's the same thing with water jug. So, hudrii, water jugs, hudrion, of the water jugs, hudriais, to or for the water jugs, hudrias, water jugs, and hudrii, if I'm talking to a bunch of water jugs. The plurals are always the same in the first declension. It's a very convenient pattern. All right, so those two forms, the eta stem and this alpha stem that you're looking at, are the two most common patterns that you get in the first declension. One just happens to represent an earlier phase of the first declension, the other a bit of a later one when Athens kind of intervened and changed the dialect a little bit. But another common pattern you can find is with nouns that keep an alpha for most of the endings, but sometimes switch between alpha and eta. These are kind of hybrid endings. One example you get is the word for bee in this chapter, or actually the root of the name Melissa. If you know someone whose name is Melissa, you can tell them that their name comes from the Greek word for a bee, a melita. Melita with the genitive should be melites at the top. That's my mistake. So what's different here, if you notice, if you go back to hudria before, is that the stem of melita does not end in epsilon, iota, or rho. When I take melita and take the alpha away, I'm left with the stem melit. So, because it doesn't end in epsilon, iota, or rho, the only difference between melita and hudria is I'm going to change the genitive and dative singular to use eta. So this is kind of a hybrid thing. This is a little bit tricky, but basically this is one of those words that kind of gets caught in the middle between early Greek stem endings and the Attic change to eta that we saw at the beginning of this lecture. So with words like melita, you can also memorize this by just memorizing melita, melites with hey for your flashcards. It goes as follows: melita, a bee; melites, of a bee; melitei, to or for a bee; meliton, if I hit a bee; melita, if I'm talking to a bee. These are all pretty much the same as what you saw in the first two lectures, but just with a combination of them. And the only way to predict this is to know if the stem doesn't end in epsilon, iota, or rho. If it doesn't have an e, or r sound to it, it's going to go back and forth. We'll get some practice with this in class, but just remember this for now and use the PDFs of these PowerPoints to keep track of this. But the nice thing, as I mentioned before, about the first declension is that the plurals are always the same. So when I go to the plurals for bees, it's the same thing as water jug or festival. So let's go through those on the right. Melitai, bees; melitone, of bees; melitais, to or for bees; melitas, if I swat at a bunch of bees; and melitai, if I talk to a bunch of bees. All right, so the alpha stem here is just a hybrid pattern. You basically memorize this by looking at the nominative and genitive of the noun to see what pattern it's going to fall under, or you can remember that rule. If the stem ends in epsilon, iota, or rho, then you're going to use alphas all the way throughout. Otherwise, it's going to either use all etas or go back and forth. That's it. That's really all there is to it. Now, this is where things might look a little confusing, and people often kind of stress out at this time of the semester because it feels like there are lots of charts, and to be sure, Chapter 4 is going to push you to do a lot of studying and a lot of memorizing. You're going to have to spend some time with this. This is not something that's just going to kind of enter your brain through osmosis, but you have to pay attention. But if you do, it's going to pay dividends. This is probably the most complicated it's really going to be for a single chapter. A lot is getting thrown at you, but it's easy enough to handle. So, as I mentioned, the first declension 90% of the time is going to be feminine nouns, but there are some nouns that follow a first declension pattern, which means that they have etas or alphas in the end of their stems and their endings, but some are masculine. One of them, very famously, is the word for poet, poietes, with the genitive poietu. Now that might have raised a couple of your eyebrows because all of a sudden we kind of have a combination of an alpha eta sound in ace and that o sound oo. There's a good reason for this because poet, because it's a masculine noun, the Greeks figured that the genitive has to sound like most of their masculine nouns from the second declension. So there's basically no other reason that it goes from poietes in the nominative, the poet, to poietu, of the poet. There's no other linguistic reason for this. It's just simply a feature of masculine nouns like poietes in the first declension. Fortunately, there aren't that many of them. This is the one that's going to feature most commonly. But there's also a rule that I want you to remember here. There are some masculine nouns that will eventually end in epsilon, iota, or rho, and they're going to have alphas throughout the endings. But because poietes doesn't, notice the stem just ends in poiete, it's going to use etas in the singular. So poietes, the poet; poietu, of the poet; back to etas for the dative and accusative; poiete, to or for the poet; poietein, if I hit a poet or something like that. That would be pretty mean of me. And the vocative, also irregular here, poieta, poieta. So this is one of those nouns you probably just have to spend some time with repeating to yourself again and again. This is probably a good one to spend 10 to 15 minutes repeating and practicing writing down. Poietes, poietu, poiete, poietein, poieta. But you really only have to know the singular because the first declension, like I said before, is always the same in the plural. So if I have more than one poet, I'll say hoi poietai, then tone poieton, of the poets; poietais, to or for the poets; poietas, the poets; and then poietai. If I talk to a bunch of poets, I'll say poietai, o poets. So the plurals are always the same, fortunately for us. Now, if I have a masculine noun from the first declension with the stem ending in iota, epsilon, or rho, it's going to do like we've seen with other first declension nouns that end in epsilon, iota, or rho. All the endings are going to have alphas instead of a does. They don't go through that change that Athens puts other first declension nouns through. So, for example, the word for a young man, neanios, typically a neanios would refer to somebody between around 12 years old to roughly 18, still growing into their prime, but not quite recognized as an adult yet. Goes as follows. The nominative is neanios, neanios, the young man. The genitive, just like with poietes, because it's a masculine noun, the Greeks wanted the genitive to sound masculine, so it goes to neaniou in the genitive, totally irregular. Back to the dative, goes back to the alpha, neania, to or for the young man. Don't forget the iota subscript. Neanion, if I hit a young man in the accusative, and if I talk to a young man, I'll say o neania. I'll keep that alpha in the end. Notice all those alphas kind of similar sounding to what you got in poietes. Plurals are all the same as all the other first declensions, so just quickly here. Neanii, neanion, neaniais, neanias, and neanii. All the plurals in the first declension are consistent every single time, so it's easy to keep track of those. But remember when we're dealing with these nouns, I mentioned the first declension doesn't determine gender, so if I have a noun like neanios, young man, I'll want to make sure I use the masculine definite article. So you've seen this chart before. You're also going to want to memorize now the feminine column, which you see in red. Now that we've got all three genders represented, you're going to want to pay very close attention to the definite article that's next to a noun because it's going to help you determine the gender along with the number and case. So I'm just going to focus on these red figures here because we've already gone through the masculine and neuter columns before, and we did some practice with them today. So you'll notice that they look very similar to a word like heorte with all of its endings. That's because this kind of borrows from the first declension endings. So the feminine definite article, the word for the, if I have a feminine noun, goes from he in the nominative, tes, genitive, tei, notice there's an iota subscript, that's the dative singular, tain, and then o for the vocative. We're always going to use o for the vocative. The plural forms for the, hai, instead of hoi, hai, tone, genitive plural, notice that's the same for all three genders, tais instead of tois, it's a slight difference, tais in the dative plural, and tas, tas in the accusative plural, feminine. So you'll want to memorize these along with the masculine and neuter to go with each noun. So for example, we saw this before when we looked at the word for time in the last lecture. Because it's masculine, I know to use the masculine column of those definite articles, ho chronos, to chronu, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, there are some nouns, and this is another one we see in this chapter, that come from the second declension that are feminine, like hodos, hodu. So just taking this one piece at a time, ignore the definite article in red for a minute. Because I know this is a second declension noun with os and u at the ending, I can fill that part in gray in easily on a chart like this. Hodos, hodu, hodo, hodon, hode, hodoi, hodon, hodois, hodus, hodoi. Easy, right? It's just the second declension endings. But it turns out that this particular word, hodos, is feminine. And the only way I'll know this on a flashcard as I'm filling one out is that I make sure to include that hey in the red at the top as part of memorizing it. The word for road, way, or journey here is a feminine concept, even though it's formed with second declension endings. Remember, declensions don't determine gender, they just determine patterns of sound. So the word for road is feminine, but because it's feminine, I'm going to use the feminine column of the definite article. I'm not going to say ha hodos, I'm going to say hey hodos, tes hodu, and so forth. So, he hodos, tes hodu, first two forms, te hodo, tain hodon, o hode, plurals, hai hodoi, ton hodon, tais hodois, tas hodus, and o hodoi. It's very important to remember this because all I'm doing in this chart is matching gender, number, and case. Hodos is a feminine noun, so I just use the feminine definite article. It's very easy to follow as long as you just remember the rules and trust your instinct to follow them. Go into some of the more regular nouns. Word for festival, right? Heorte, heortes, I know is feminine because it goes with he, is going to form with the same definite articles. He, heorte, he, tes, heortes, te, heorte, tain, heortain, and so forth. Hi, heortai, ton, heorton, tais, heortais, and tas, heortas. Easy. But you also want to make sure you're using the same definite articles, even if the first declension noun changes. If it's feminine but it's still hudria, you're still going to use those eta sounding definite articles. They don't change. So I'll say he hudria, not ha hudria. He hudria, tes hudrias, te hudria, tain hudrion. Go through the plurals. Hi hudriai, ton hudrion, tais hudriais, tas hudrias. Same with the word for bee. Same definite articles because it's feminine. He melita, the bee. Tes melites, the bee of the bee. Te melite, to or for the bee. Tain meliton, something to the bee. Plurals, hi melitai, ton meliton, tais melitais, tas melitas. Pretty straightforward. On the other hand, even if it's a first declension noun like poet, which is masculine, I'm going to change the gender of the definite article. So even though poietes forms with the first declension endings, poietes, poietu, poiete, poieton, etc., I'm still going to use ha, tu, to, and ton because it's a masculine noun. Poets are typically male in Greek society, even though the word itself comes from the first declension of endings. So even though it doesn't look like they go together, they actually do match. They're both masculine. Ha poietes, the poet. I can't use he poietes because it's a masculine noun. Tu poietu, to poiete, it doesn't sound the same, but they match. They're both masculine. Ton poieton. Hoi poietai, again, they don't sound the same, but this all matches. Gender, number, and case. Nominative, plural, masculine. Hoi poietai. Ton poieton, tois poietais, tus poietas, and so forth. So remember, it's gender, number, and case. Declensions don't determine gender. Just match those three things for every noun that you're memorizing. And then we'll just do one more example. Young man will go as follows. Because it's masculine, which I'll know by putting ha along with the noun itself in my flashcards, I'm going to say ha neanias, never he. Ha neanias, the young man, masculine. Tu neaniu, that happens to rhyme. To neania. Even though it doesn't sound the same, they're different vowel systems, they match in gender. They're both masculine, they're both dative, and they're both singular. To neania go together. Ton neanion, same thing, accusative singular masculine. Ton neanion. Plurals, hoi neaniai, ton neonion, neanion, tois neaniais, and tus neanias. So again, don't rely on making them rhyme or sound the same. Oftentimes they will, but sometimes they won't. Remember gender, number, and case. Those are the three things you have to match every single time you're dealing with adjectives and definite articles. So you've seen this slide a couple times before. Just remember, with words like dikaiopolis sophos or hokalos anthropos, you have to match nouns, adjectives, and definite articles, the words for the, in gender, number, case. Remember that list. It's just like person, number, tense, mood, and voice for verbs. Case, number, gender for nouns, adjectives, and definite articles. Okay, so now that we've got a good sense of definite articles and these different nouns, you can now deal with the full breadth of some of the different adjectives that you've been seeing in this chapter and last chapter. One of the most common ones you'll see is the word for beautiful or fine, which will typically appear with three forms in your dictionary entries or in your vocab lists. And this is the way you'll want to remember them and memorize them on your flashcards. So let's start with this one. Kalos, kale, kalon. Or sometimes you'll see kalos, a, on for the three endings with the stem of kal, if you take that os away. That means beautiful or fine. It's the root of a word like calligraphy, for example. Those three forms at the top, kalos, kale, kalon, are all the nominative singular forms for the masculine, feminine, and neuter genders in order. So if you look on the left side of this chart, at the top, you'll see kalos, kale, kalon in the nominative line. There they are at the top left, kalos, kale, kalon. That tells me that this adjective is going to follow the second declension for endings in the masculine and neuter column, column 1 and 3, while it follows the first declension in the feminine column. This is why we call it a first and second declension adjective, or I like to call these 2-1-2 adjectives, because it goes second declension, first declension, second declension again. 2-1-2, masculine, feminine, neuter. So, as you can see in the chart here, there's nothing new in any of the endings here for the adjectives. So the masculine column for kalos follows the second declension masculine endings. Kalos, kalu, kalo, kalon, kale. You already know those endings. The neuter, same thing. Second declension neuter. Kalon, kalu, kalo, kalon, kalon. Make sure the accusative follows the nominative. The feminine column in the middle follows the first declension set of endings. Kale, kales, kale, kalein, kale. This one happens to use the etas because the stem, kal, does not end in epsilon, iota, or rho. So you can also just memorize kalos, kale, kalon to remember that. All the plurals keep following the same pattern. The masculine column, second declension masculine endings. Kaloi, kalon, kalois, kalus, kaloi. The feminine column, first declension plural endings. Kalai, kalon, kalais, kalas, kalai, if I'm describing more than one feminine noun as beautiful. And neuter is going to follow the second declension masculine endings. Kala, kalon, kalois, kala, kala. Remember, nominative and accusative are always going to match each other. There are some adjectives, including hradios, hradia, hradion. It's a little tricky to pronounce. Remember that rose oftentimes get breathing marks, so you can, if you want to pronounce it as just hradios, that's fine too. But technically, it would sound like hradios, hradios, or hradia, hradion. Is also going to follow a 2-1-2 system. The masculine and the neuter columns are going to follow the second declension for each gender. So let's just take care of the blue and purple right now. Masculine, hradios, hradiu, hradio, hradion, hradie. If I'm describing someone as easy or simple, hradios. Neuter, hradion, hradiu, hradio, hradion, hradion. And I'll just knock out the plurals for those real quick. So following the blue and purple on the right, we'll start with the masculine blue column. If I have more than one person I'm describing as easy, I'll call them hradioi, hradion, hradiois, hradius, and hradioi. That's that blue column on the right. Now moving to the magenta or purple for the neuter, I'm going to start with hradia. Remember, that's the neuter ending in the second declension. Hradion of the easy things. Hradiois, hradia, hradia. Remember, nominative and accusative, always the same in the neuter. The feminine column, however, is going to follow the first declension endings, but notice how this is different from kalos, kale, kalon, which we just saw before. This time, because the stem of this adjective, if I take away the os and on, ends in radi with that iota, it's going to do just like the word hudria did as the noun. All the endings are going to feature alphas instead of etas. So if you can remember that rule, epsilon, iota, and rho gives you alpha endings in the first declension, then this is a piece of cake. There's nothing new here. So if I'm describing one single female noun as easy, I'll say hradia, never hradie. That doesn't happen, just hradia. Genitive hradias, dative hradia with an iota subscript, hradion, hradia. The plurals, like all plurals in the first declension, are the same. Hradiai, hradion, hradiais, hradias, hradii. So, these are the two systems you'll want to know for 2-1-2 adjectives. Sometimes you have os a and on, like kalas, kale, kalon. Sometimes you get os a on with radios, radia, radion, and so on and so forth. So let's see a couple of these in action just so that we can see how this fits. Let's take the word hudria, which is a water jug, and I want to describe it as beautiful in all the different cases. The way I pick the right endings is to know what gender that noun is. And I know from memorizing hudria and hudrios with the article hey that it's feminine. So going back, I'm going to use the feminine column of endings, starting with kale, to describe the water jug. So hey, kale, hudria, is how I'm going to say the beautiful water jug in the nominative, singular, feminine box. They all match gender, number, and case. Even though they don't all have the same endings, Kale doesn't switch to alphas like Hudria does, they still match. They're all the same gender. So they don't have to rhyme. Sometimes they will, but they don't have to. I just have to know what case they go in. The genitive, tes kales hudrias of the beautiful water jug, te kale hudria, to or for the beautiful water jug, tain kalein hudrion, the beautiful water jug in the accusative, and o kale hudria in the vocative. Let's look at the plurals real quick. These will happen to rhyme. That's pretty easy for the first declension. Hai kalai hudriai, the beautiful water jugs. Ton kalon hudrion of the beautiful water jugs. Tais kalais hudriais, to or for the beautiful water jugs. Tas kalas hudrias, beautiful water jugs, and o kalai hudriai, o beautiful water jugs, if I decided to talk to a bunch of them. Remember, gender, number, case. Don't always have to rhyme, but I can always match them whatever's happening to the endings if they've gone through an eta shift or not. Let's use a very different example. If I want to take a young man and describe him as beautiful or fine or handsome, let's just call kalas beautiful to keep it consistent here, I'm going to use the masculine column of endings to describe him. Even though it doesn't have the first declension set of endings, it's still going to match him in gender, number, and case. So if a beautiful young man is my subject, I'll start with neanias, that's my nominative form of that noun, but I'm going to call him kalos because that's the masculine form of the adjective for beautiful, and I'll stick it with ha. Ha kalos neanias, the beautiful young man. Tu kalu neaniu, of the beautiful young man. To kalo neania, to or for the beautiful man. Ton kalon neanian, the beautiful man if I see him, for example. O kale neania, or O beautiful young man. And remember, I'm matching them in gender, number, and case, even if they have different declension style endings, even if they don't rhyme, as long as I go one by one. And if you're practicing this on your own, the best way to go through this is to take one word at a time. If I know I'm using neanias, young man, fill out those forms first, neanias, neaniu, neania, etc. Then go back and say, all right, I need to describe him as beautiful. Which column of kalas, kale, kalan am I going to use? Well, I need to use the first one, kalas, because it's a masculine noun. So I'm just going to put the right forms of kalas in, kalas, kalu, kalo, kalan, and so forth. And then you can go back and say, well, because this is a masculine noun, I'm going to start with the definite article ha and use those ones instead of the feminine or neuter, which give you ha, tu, to, ton, and o. Stick with that system and you will always be able to match gender, number, and case correctly. Even if it looks a little different, trust your knowledge of those systems and you'll be fine. Let's just go through the plurals real quick. Hoi kaloi neaniai, ton kalon neanion, tois kalois neaniais, tus kalus neanias, and o kaloi neaniai. So remember, gender, number, and case is the rule you have to remember however you can for matching articles, adjectives, and nouns. Okay, on page 60 of your textbook, you have a couple irregular adjectives, megas, megale, mega, and paulus, pale, palu. I don't want you to memorize those for now because you've got plenty else on your plate for this chapter, but I at least want you to be aware that you are going to see those. So I want you to know that on page 60 of your textbook, as long as you're using the same edition I am, you'll want to just keep those in kind of your view for reference. But for now, use them just as reference. I want you to focus on matching your first and second declension nouns with those 2-1-2 adjectives that we were going through before. That's plenty for us to cover for now. Megas, megale, mega, and paulus, pale, palu, we can leave aside until a little bit later, but at least be aware that those are also going to be in this chapter, and you will need to be able to handle those for translation. And eventually, if you do have time to start memorizing them, by all means do so, but I'd rather you focus your time on the regular adjectives for now. So, let's wrap this up by talking through some vocabulary. The word akuo, you saw before, means to hear, but it can take a couple cases, interestingly. If I say I hear someone, i.e. I hear someone talking, I'll put that person in the genitive with akuo. So I could say akuo tu anthropu, I hear the man. But if I hear something being spoken by that person, I'll put that thing, those words or the sound or music, in the accusative, because that's technically, for the Greeks, what your ear is hearing. You're not hearing the physical person making the sound, you're hearing the sound that comes from them. We'll talk more about this in class. It's a little bit tricky, but just remember that if you hear someone, you hear them in the genitive, but if you hear a sound, you hear it as an accusative thing. But either way, you'll translate akuo as I hear, I listen, akuo. Ethelo is another important word in Greek, which always comes with an infinitive and means I wish or I am willing to do something. And that to do something is going to be covered by an infinitive in Greek, to blank. So if you see an Ethelo, look for some form of the infinitive nearby. Another important word is echo. Echo means I have or I hold something physically. Theoreo means I watch or I see, I look at something. Poieo, there's an epsilon contract word, hint, hint, so you'll want to make sure to remember those contraction rules from the beginning of this lecture. Poieo means to make or to do something. So this is actually the root for the word for poet. A poet makes and does stuff in ancient Greek. Poieo. Kairo means I rejoice, and this is our root, which some of you asked me about before, for how do I say hello? Well, you tell someone to be happy. You say kaire, or if you're talking to more than one person, you'll say kairete, greetings, rejoice, be happy, I'm here, kairete. Peitho means I persuade. If I persuade you to do something, I'll say peitho. And stenadzo, we saw in one of our early readings, means to groan. Stenadzo, I groan. So you want to memorize those verbs, and remember, poieo and theoreo are going to go through epsilon contraction, so make sure that you're memorizing those rules with epsilon running into other vowels. Some important adjectives. Argos, eon, means lazy, argos. Allos, alle, Allah, os ea, means other or another. Radios, radia, radion, notice my stress there, radia, radion for the feminine, means easy. We saw how that broke down before. And finally, philos, phile, philon, means loved or dear to someone, which is why sometimes I'll see an article put with that adjective to make a noun. Philos means the dear one or the beloved one, or more simply, the friend. And I can also use the feminine hephile if I want to refer to a girlfriend instead of a boyfriend. Hophilos or hephile. Some nouns from this chapter, a lot for you to keep track of, and these are important words that you're going to see quite a lot. Starting with ha-angelos. Remember, two gammas together make an ng sound. Ha-angelos means messenger. It's our root for the word angel because angels are messengers from God in the New Testament. Angelos. A man in ancient Greek is ha-aner. Ha-aner. This comes from the third declension, so for now you just kind of have to know that ha-aner itself means man. The accusative looks like this, ton andra, and if I talk to a man or a husband, as it can sometimes be translated, I'll say o-aner with the short epsilon. On the other hand, if I have a wife, I would say hegune, which means woman or wife. This is the root for gynecology, gune. For the most part, we're going to see the plurals in some of the stories that you're reading. So the vocative is o gunai, o women, hai gunaikes, the women, and tas gunaikas for the accusative plural. It means woman or women, and so the plural or wife. Festival we saw was heorte, feminine noun. The word for daughter, which we're not going to see too much broken down, but is thugater. It comes from the third declension, so you're not going to see all the other endings for now. Thugater, daughter. Hokairos, masculine noun, means the time or the right time, kind of like a good opportunity is a kairos in Greek. The word for spring in the sense of a body of water, not the season, but rather like a small brook, is hekrene, a small spring. Hemeter is a mother, hemeter, mother. Hehudria, we saw meant water jar or water jug. Hakoros is a dance or chorus, which is its cognate in English. Hege means earth, land, or ground. So if you study geology, that's because you have the root for ge in your studies. Hege, earth, land, ground. And then finally, hodos, which we saw before, was a road or a journey. Second declension noun because it ends in os, and so it's going to go os, u, o, on, and so forth. But it's feminine, so you'll want to use he, taste, te, and tain with it. Very important to memorize them together. Hodos. A couple other words, some adverbs from this chapter, quite a lot that are going to be added to your arsenal. Ae means always. How often does someone do it? I, always. Malista means especially or most of all or very much. If I like something a lot, I'll say malista in ancient Greek. That's also used in modern Greek. Oikade means toward home. That de ending on the end of it, you can recognize the oikos root in there. That ade ending means in the direction of the oikos. So oikade means homeward or to home. You've seen idu before in the reading. It means look, if I'm telling someone to look at something. Kai, in addition to meaning and, being a connecting idea, can also be used adverbially, either to mean even, I even see this, or sometimes means something like also, or I see that too. I also see that. Kai blepo, for example. Mala can mean very. Molus is its opposite, scarcely, not very much at all, reluctantly in some cases. If someone is not willing to do something very much at all, they might say, molus, I don't really feel like it, or it's too difficult for me. Molus, scarcely, with difficulty. Proton, which again is our root for the word for proton in physics, means the first, or first of all, adverbially. If I do something first before everybody else, I'll say I did it proton first. And then finally, takeos. Takeos means quickly or swiftly. I did something very fast. That's our root for words like tachycardia. If you have tachycardia, that means you have a fast heartbeat. Tachycardia. Some important prepositions. Remember, when you're memorizing prepositions, memorize the word and the case that it goes with. So apo, very importantly, takes the genitive and means from something or away from something. Apo plus the genitive, away or from. Here comes pros again. You've already learned pros plus the accusative means to or towards, but sometimes the word pros can go with the dative. And when it does, it doesn't mean to or towards, but instead means at, near, or by. In other words, when I use it with an accusative, I'm implying some motion. I'm walking in the direction of, i.e. towards something. But if I say I'm walking pros something in the dative, like a tree, for example, prostodendro, that means I'm already near the tree. So I'm walking near the tree, I'm walking by the tree, but I'm not walking in the direction of it. I could be walking around it or away from it, but I'm near the tree. So that's a very subtle but important difference in meaning. Pros plus the accusative, to or towards, plus pros plus the dative, near, at, or by something. Couple more things to wrap up. The word ara is tricky to deal with. You don't really translate it. It doesn't really have an equivalent in English, but it shows up at the beginning of a sentence to signal a question. So in a way, it's almost kind of like a question mark. So you don't have to worry about translating it, but just remember that it implies that a question is being asked. A very important phrase that you're learning in this chapter as well is en no echo. En no echo, which takes an infinitive because it's an expression that means I intend to do something, which is why you use an infinitive, to blank. What it literally means is I have in mind. That word no there means mind, your head. So if I have something in mind, like I would say in English, I have it in mind to do something, I mean I intend to do X. So en no echo, I intend, or I have it in mind. And then finally, we saw this in one of the readings before in a glossed note, but now you want to remember T. And it's very important here that you pay attention to the accent over that iota. T, when it has an accent and gets a little stressed, T can either mean what is something or why is something happening. It can ask either question, so you have to use context to figure out which one makes more sense. There's nothing else that will help you with that. You just have to know it can mean either. We'll talk more about that in class. All right, So that's it for this week. For Monday, as I mentioned in class, I want you to prepare reading for alpha, which means you need to translate the passages or at least have a very clearly defined question ready to show me that you did the work and aren't just making it up on the spot. And in addition to that, you should prepare and finish exercises for beta, for gamma, for delta, and for epsilon. I know that sounds like a lot, but there's actually not a whole lot in each of those exercises. They should be relatively easy to finish, and by all means, work in groups to do so if you feel that's going to help you. But keep in mind that in addition to those things, you'll be getting back your last quiz and getting a new one on the vocabulary for Chapter 3. So don't forget about the last lecture with its vocabulary. That's going to be tested on Monday. So don't forget, that's coming up. In the meantime, remember to submit your reviews by Sunday on Blackboard. And if you have any questions in the meantime, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'll talk to you guys soon. Have a great weekend. Take care.